topic today is dealing with grief. Can grief counseling help? All right, so grief. When you hear this, I imagine you start thinking of death, because this is typically the context that we use this word of grieving. But really, this phenomenon that happens, the empty sorrow, deep sadness that we feel when we are grieving, can come from any kind of loss. So whether that's a huge change in your life, meaning you are now grieving the loss of how things used to be. So examples of things that we grieve over, even if we don't use that language, is maybe you now lost your job, or your home has been destroyed, or you're going through a breakup, or there's just been some significant change to your personal life or your professional life. All these big changes and losses of things are also things that we can grieve over, and it's not always just about somebody that has died. Many of us have heard of these various stages of grief, and this kind of model of looking at grief has evolved and changed a lot over time. But the idea now is that not everybody experiences grief the same way. Not everybody will go through all of these known stages, and there's no particular order in which we go through these stages. And experiencing grief is a normal part of life. If you are grieving, you may not need any kind of professional help or intervention to heal with time. The problem, I think, lies in situations where you are unable to move beyond these stages of grief and find yourself in the final stage of acceptance, which helps you move on with your life. So getting stuck in one of these stages, or finding yourself cycling through these stages, never being able to move on, that's where things get a little bit more complex, and that's where we see what's called complicated grief, or complicated bereavement even, where it starts really impacting your ability to function out there in your real life. It's really important to remember and remind yourself that everyone grieves differently. There is no correct timeline for this, and grief is not linear. So I think it's very, very good to be gentle to yourself, to give yourself the space and the time to heal in your own unique way. And not really holding yourself to some kind of notion that you have to be feeling better by this date. You have to have been able to, move on from this situation and go back to normal, just like things were before. People may expect that of you, but you do not need to carry that and take that on for yourself. You have your own timeline. It's your own life, just like anything else out there. So give yourself what it is that you need to heal. I can probably say it over and over again that everybody grieves differently. So, giving yourself, like I said, exactly what it is that you need to find yourself moving on and flourishing in your life once again becomes very important. Of course, the worst case scenario, which does happen to some individuals, is to experience this loss and go through some of the feelings that come with grief, which include being angry, which include being very, very sad, or even being in denial about certain things. And like I said, the worst case scenario is for someone to live the rest of their lives stuck in that kind of emotional headspace. So it's going to be important in those situations, and I believe it's like less than 15% of people that experience grief that will find themselves in these situations where they're not getting better on their own. In those small percentage of situations, I think it's now time to start considering whether or not you need to talk to somebody, whether that's a friend or a therapist or a grief counselor specifically. I think a lot of us that have really significant relationships with people, really deep connections with individuals that may pass away sometime in our lives, those relationships are really hard to mourn and to lose, especially if for some reason, or for whatever reason, for all the reasons in the world, you don't have a really strong sense of identity on your own. So an example that I'm thinking of is perhaps an individual who has been with their partner since late adolescence. They got married and they spent their entire lives together. And couples like this, I see it sometimes where one of the partner does die of old age, and the surviving partner then really loses this sense of purpose and no longer really has identity anymore, because their whole identity was so intertwined and mixed up and mixed into the identity of their partner too. They were this unit package, and now that their partner is no longer here, sometimes they really lose themselves because they only thought of themselves in the context of this relationship. So I think it's important to constantly be thinking about the notion that you are still you. This very important person may not be here physically anymore, but that doesn't mean that your identity is gone. You're still this same person, and you can still carry on your life honoring somebody's memory and really respecting who they were while respecting who you are too. In general, time typically heals most instances of grief. I did mention that this small percentage of people will find themselves continuing to grieve for a very long time, having a hard time getting out of it on their own and returning to normal or baseline functioning. In those situations, grief counseling can be a really good option to look into. It's a strategy and a way to get you into some kind of accountable routine to talk about your feelings, to process and unpack some of the stuff that you're hanging on to. And it's also very important to note, you may want to get somebody you care about into grief counseling because you're noticing they're having a really hard time managing this. However, research has indicated that grief counseling is most effective when the affected person is the one to get themselves into treatment themselves. Why? I mean, it's the same kind of logic behind anybody going into any kind of treatment. If you don't want to be there, if there's some part of you that doesn't want to be there or doesn't believe that it's going to be helpful, that's most likely going to come true. So I can understand us wanting to help our loved ones that are having a really hard time with grief, but trying to force them into therapy is probably not going to be super helpful. So when it's you that's grieving, give yourself space and time. When it's someone that you love that's grieving, give them space and time. If you liked this video, please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find a lot more content on a variety of mental health topics. If you're interested in learning more about online counseling, please click the link to BetterHelp.com below.